So, welcome to today's Deep Dives. I'm your host, and I'm joined as always by our resident medical expert to unpack some pretty fascinating source material today.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this one. It's a topic that I think touches a lot of people's lives, whether they realize it or not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're listening to this, you've probably lived in the modern world long enough to know that we are basically obsessed with this concept of willpower.
Right, completely obsessed.
Like we have this pervasive, almost, foundational societal belief that if you just want something badly enough, or if you just try harder, you can overcome literally any internal resistance.
Yeah, it's the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality
Yeah,
applied to the brain.
exactly. And we've built entire productivity empires, self-help industries, and like corporate evaluation metrics on this one assumption, the assumption that executive function is just a muscle you choose to flex.
Which is, biologically speaking, just completely false.
Right. And that's exactly what we're getting into today, because when you look at the actual neurobiology of attention and motivation, that entire framework just completely collapses. It's a biological fiction.
It really is. And, the persistence of that fiction is arguably the single greatest barrier to effective care for neurodivergent adults right now.
Wow, the single greatest barrier.
Oh, without a doubt. Because we operate in a society that still fundamentally conflates the physical architecture of the brain with moral character.
Right.
Like when a person fails to initiate a task or they can't sustain focus or they act impulsively, the immediate default is to diagnose a character flaw
Right.
rather than looking at it as a mechanical deficit.
Yeah, we just assume they're lazy, which is why the source material we're examining today is so striking. We are looking at a really concise but incredibly direct excerpt from the Japanese medical media outlet, Medical DOC.
Yeah, medical DOC, they do some really interesting work.
They do. And this piece focuses specifically on the realities of adult ADHD. And what stands out to me immediately is not just the medical information it presents, but the really aggressive stance it takes against this exact societal baggage we're talking about.
The phrasing they use is really deliberate.
It is. The text explicitly states its mission is to dispel misunderstandings and provide correct knowledge. Like it's drawing a very hard line in the sand between cultural bias and biological reality.
And the context of that publication is actually really vital here.
Oh, yeah. Break that down for us.
Well, in Japanese medical communication, there's often this really strong emphasis on achieving what they term tadasuku ikaisuru, which basically means correct understanding.
Okay.
And it's done for the sake of social harmony and effective integration. So the authors of this piece recognize that the current public understanding is just structurally flawed.
They see the disconnect.
Exactly. They are stepping in as medical authorities to correct a record. Because, honestly, without that baseline of objective truth, the individual is left fighting a war on two fronts.
What do you mean by two fronts?
Well, you have the internal struggle of their neurobiology, right? Just
Yeah.
trying to get through the day.
Yeah.
And then you have the external struggle against a society that constantly insists they're simply not trying hard enough.
Man, that sounds exhausting. Just an exhausting way to live.
It's incredibly draining, which is why this article is so important.
Well, let's get into the specifics of those misunderstandings because the excerpt targets two really pervasive myths right out of the gate.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back at all.
Not at all. It states unequivocally that adult ADHD is medically shown not to be caused by upbringing or a problem of the person's willpower.
Those two specifically.
Right. And by explicitly naming these two vectors of blame, the medical establishment is actively severing the link between moral failing and neurological reality.
And that willpower myth, it's particularly insidious because executive dysfunction, which is basically the core hallmark of ADHD, it looks identical to a lack of willpower from the outside.
It really does. If I just see someone sitting there, it looks like they're just choosing not to work.
Right. But if we define executive function structurally, we're talking about the brain's management system. It's housed primarily in the prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead.
Like the CEO of the brain.
Exactly, the CEO. And this involves working memory, emotional regulation, task initiation, and the ability to shift attention.
So it's juggling a lot.
A ton. And when a person without ADHD decides to do a task, their prefrontal cortex seamlessly coordinates with the brain's reward centers to initiate action. It's an automatic process.
So to use an analogy, it's kind of like putting your foot on the gas pedal of a car. You press the pedal, the gas flows, the car moves.
That's a great way to look at it.
But when someone with ADHD fails to do that, the observer just assumes the person chose not to press the pedal.
Exactly.
The observer can't see that the fuel line is disconnected. They just see a person sitting in a parked car, ostensibly doing nothing, and they start yelling at the car to just try harder.
Yes, yelling at a car with no gas. And the cognitive dissonance for the individual experiencing it is profound.
I can't even imagine.
I mean, an adult with ADHD might desperately want to finish that report or do that chore. They might completely understand the severe consequences of failing to do so.
So the motivation is there, intellectually at least.
Completely. The intellectual motivation is absolutely there. But the actual neurochemical bridge required to translate that intellectual desire into physical action, it's structurally compromised.
Wow.
So treating that as a willpower problem is literally akin to telling someone with myopia that they just need to try harder to see the chalkboard without their glasses.
That's such a good point. But the analogy kind of breaks down in society, doesn't it? Because society views vision as a mechanical process. We accept that eyes need glasses,
Right.
but we still view motivation as a spiritual or moral process. Like, we treat the prefrontal cortex totally differently than we treat the retina.
We do, and it's wildly unfair. And, the second myth the medical DOC text dismantles is the idea that ADHD is a product of upbringing. And that one carries a different but equally damaging kind of historical baggage.
Yeah, let's talk about the parenting blame game, because that goes back a long way.
It really does. The psychological establishment spent a massive portion of the 20th century just blaming parents for a whole host of neurodevelopmental conditions.
Like the refrigerator mother theory with autism.
Exactly, the refrigerator mother theory. And we saw similar psychoanalytic approaches that attributed attention deficits and hyperactive behavior to poor disciplinary structures at home, or maternal anxiety, or emotional coldness.
Basically, anything the mom did wrong was the cause.
Pretty much. The assumption was that the child failed to internalize societal rules simply because the parents failed to enforce them properly.
And that history, it leaves a long shadow. Because even today, there's a lingering assumption that an adult struggling with executive function just never learned proper discipline or work ethic as a kid.
Yeah, people think they just need a stricter boss or a rigid routine.
Right. And it places this immense, completely unwarranted guilt on the family unit, and it reinforces the idea that the individual could simply learn their way out of the condition if they just had the right rigid structure imposed on them.
But by stating definitively that this is a medical issue and not an upbringing issue, the source shifts the paradigm entirely.
It really changes the whole conversation.
It moves it from the courtroom of moral judgment into the laboratory of objective biological reality. And, the relief that comes with that shift for the individual, it really cannot be overstated.
It must feel like a massive weight lifting off their shoulders.
It recontextualizes their entire life history. Every missed deadline, every forgotten appointment, every time they were reprimanded for a careless mistake.
It's all suddenly viewed through the lens of a mechanical deficit.
Exactly. Rather than a fundamental character flaw.
Now, I do want to push back on a potential point of confusion in the text, though, because we're talking about the listener right now, and they might be thinking the same thing.
Sure, what's the confusion?
Well, the excerpt unequivocally dismisses upbringing as a cause, right? But then it subsequently states that these developmental disorders arise from a complex intertwining of genetic factors and environmental factors.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. On the surface, ruling out upbringing while pointing to environmental factors feels totally contradictory. If we aren't talking about the social environment of the home, what exactly does environmental factors mean in this strictly biological context?
It's a great question, and the terminology can definitely be misleading if we apply, colloquial definitions to medical literature.
Right, because when I hear environment, I think of the house you grew up in.
Exactly. In everyday conversation, environment is almost always a synonym for social surroundings or upbringing. But in neurodevelopmental science, environmental factors refers to the literal physiological ecosystem the developing brain is subjected to.
So totally separate from the psychological aspects of parenting.
Completely separate. We are talking about biological, chemical, and physical exposures.
Okay, give me the structural breakdown of what those physiological exposures actually look like in the context of neurodevelopment. Like, what is a biological environment?
Well, a significant portion occurs prenatally, while the brain is first forming. Factors such as maternal hypoxia,
Which is a lack of oxygen.
right, a lack of oxygen during fetal development, or exposure to certain neurotoxins, or severe maternal immune activation due to a bad infection, or even premature birth, all of these fall under this biological environment umbrella.
Okay, so it's the physical conditions the brain is growing in.
Yes. And postnatally, after birth, it can include severe early life neuroinflammation or traumatic brain injury. It encompasses the physical interactions that physically alter the developmental trajectory of the brain architecture.
So just to make sure I have this straight, if a mother experiences a severe infection during a critical window of fetal brain development, the resulting inflammatory response could serve as an environmental trigger that alters how the fetus's neural pathways form. And that has absolutely nothing to do with whether that child is later grounded for not doing their homework.
Precisely. It is entirely biological. And the key phrase the medical DOC text uses here is complex intertwining.
Complex
Now,
intertwining.
we are looking at epigenetic interactions. The current scientific consensus points to what we call the diathesis stress model.
Diathesis stress. Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It basically means polygenic risk interacting with environmental triggers.
Oh.
So there is no single ADHD gene. You don't just inherit one gene and automatically have it.
Right, it's not like eye color.
No, it's way more complex. Instead, an individual might inherit a specific polygenic risk score. That's a combination of different genetic variants, perhaps involving the DRD4 or DL1 genes, which govern dopamine receptors and transporters.
So those genetic variants essentially load the dice, they create the underlying blueprint or the vulnerability, but the physiological environment dictates whether those traits actually manifest or to what degree they manifest.
You nailed it. And the text uses the phrasing traits appear, which is a highly accurate way to frame it. The genetic blueprint might lie completely dormant.
Really? Dormant.
Yeah. Or it might only manifest as very mild subclinical traits unless it interacts with a specific physiological environmental factor.
Okay, can you give me an example of how that interaction happens?
Sure. So for instance, a child might have the genetic predisposition for altered dopamine transport, right? But it requires a secondary physiological stressor, like premature birth or early neuroinflammation, to alter the brain's development enough to cross the threshold into clinical ADHD.
Wow, so it was literally a symphony of different genes interacting with a complex web of physiological environmental factors over years.
It really is a symphony.
Yeah.
And that understanding naturally leads us to the actual micromechanisms,
Right.
because we've established the macro origins, right? This polygenic and epigenetic intertwining.
Yeah.
But the source specifically promises to reveal that brain mechanism.
Yes, that brain mechanism. I love how dramatic that sounds.
It's very dramatic but accurate. It zooms in on the literal chemical level of the adult brain, explicitly naming the functioning of specific neurotransmitters.
Dopamine and noradrenaline.
Exactly. And this is where we move from the abstract concept of a developmental disorder to the tangible reality of synaptic transmission.
We're looking at the actual chemicals moving around.
Right. By isolating these specific catecholamines, the text grounds the condition in measurable physical chemistry.
Well, we really need to unpack the mechanics of these neurotransmitters beyond the basic, chemical messenger concept, because I think people have a lot of misconceptions here.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at dopamine first, because popular culture has drastically oversimplified it as the pleasure chemical.
The pleasure chemical. Yeah, that drives me crazy.
Right, and that completely fails to explain its role in executive function. Like,
Right.
if it's just about pleasure, why does it affect my ability to fill out a spreadsheet?
Exactly. In the context of ADHD, we are primarily looking at dopamine's role in reward prediction error and the mesocortical limbic pathway.
Okay, the popular understanding of dopamine is flawed, you said. Break that down for us.
It is fundamentally flawed. It is way less about the actual experience of pleasure itself and far more about motivation, salience, and the anticipation of a reward.
Salience meaning, like, how important something feels.
Yes, exactly. How much your brain cares about a specific stimulus. In the context of executive function, dopamine is the chemical that bridges the gap between knowing you need to do a task and actually initiating the physical action to do it.
So it dictates how the brain assigns value to an action.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's say I have a report due on Friday and it's currently Wednesday. My prefrontal cortex knows the report is important. For a neurotypical brain, anticipating the completion of that report or anticipating the negative consequence of failing to complete it, that triggers a release of dopamine that motivates task initiation.
That's exactly how it works for a neurotypical brain. The dopamine spikes and you start typing. But in the ADHD brain, the dopamine signaling is impaired.
How so? Like, is there not enough of it?
Well, the prevailing theory involves the dopamine transporter, or DA. In a typical synapse, dopamine is released by the presynaptic neuron. It crosses the synaptic cleft, and it binds to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron to pass the signal along.
Okay, presynaptic sends it, postsynaptic receives it. Got it.
Right. And the dopamine transporter's job is to act like a little vacuum. It sucks the dopamine back up into the presynaptic neuron once the signal is sent, just to clear the cleft for the next signal.
Okay, so it cleans up the space. So what's the mechanism of impairment in ADHD? Does the vacuum break?
Actually, it's the opposite. The theory suggests that these transporters are either too numerous or they are operating way too efficiently.
Wait, really? The vacuum is too good.
Yes, they vacuum up the dopamine before it actually has a chance to bind to the postsynaptic receptors in sufficient quantities. So the signal is sent, but the receiver doesn't get enough of it to trigger the motivation pathway.
Oh, wow. So consequently, the individual experiences a chronic deficit of baseline dopamine signaling.
Exactly. And because of that deficit, tasks that don't offer immediate high stakes or intensely novel rewards simply do not generate enough dopaminergic activity to cross the threshold for initiation.
That makes so much sense. This is why individuals with ADHD can hyper-focus on a video game for 6 hours, right?
Yes, that's exactly why, because the game provides a constant, rapid-fire stream of immediate rewards.
Yeah.
You get points, you level up, there are flashing lights.
And that artificially spikes dopamine levels enough to sustain engagement.
Right, but a long-term project with a delayed reward, like that report due on Friday, it just fails to generate that necessary chemical momentum.
Because the vacuum is sucking up the little bit of dopamine that's there before it can do anything.
Exactly. You literally don't have the chemical fuel to start the task.
That is fascinating. Okay, so that's dopamine, the engine of motivation. Now, the second neurotransmitter the text identifies is noradrenaline or norepinephrine.
Yes, noradrenaline.
And if dopamine is the engine of motivation, noradrenaline functions more as the director of attention, right? Like it modulates the signal-to-noise ratio in the brain.
That's a perfect way to put it. Noradrenaline is heavily concentrated in a part of the brain called the locus coeruleus.
The locus coeruleus.
Yeah, and that projects broadly across the cortex, particularly to our old friend, the prefrontal cortex. Its primary role in executive function is maintaining arousal and sustained attention.
Okay, give us a real-world example of how that works.
Sure. So when you sit down to read a complex document, your brain is simultaneously receiving input from, well, everything. The temperature of the room, the sound of traffic outside, maybe a flickering light, and your own internal tangential thoughts.
Right, my brain is taking all of that in at once.
Exactly. And noradrenaline helps the prefrontal cortex amplify the relevant signal, which is the document, while suppressing the irrelevant noise, like the traffic outside.
It's like turning up the volume on the book and muting the rest of the work.
Right. And the relationship between noradrenaline levels and cognitive performance actually follows an inverted U curve.
An inverted U curve. Explain that for us.
So imagine a graph shaped like an upside-down U. If noradrenaline levels are too low, you're at the bottom left of the curve. The brain is under-aroused. You feel lethargic, inattentive, and sluggish. You can't focus because nothing is stimulating enough.
Okay, that makes sense. And what if it's too high?
If levels are too high, you're at the bottom right of the curve. This happens in a state of panic or extreme stress. You become hyper-aroused, completely distracted, and unable to focus on a single complex task because your brain is frantically scanning the environment for threats.
Ah, right. You're too wired to read a spreadsheet.
Exactly. The sweet spot is right at the top of that inverted U.
So how does this play out for someone with ADHD?
Well, individuals with ADHD often struggle with chronic underarousal in this locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. They are stuck on the low end of the curve.
So the signal-to-noise ratio is completely unbalanced.
Exactly. The brain cannot effectively filter out background stimuli, which makes sustained attention on a low salience task just neurologically exhausting. The prefrontal cortex simply does not have the chemical conductors it needs to orchestrate focus.
Wow. So when we combine the dysfunction of these two systems, the dopaminergic failure to initiate and sustain motivation, and the noradrenergic failure to filter noise and sustain attention, we have a complete mechanical explanation for the behaviors that society so easily dismisses as laziness or lack of willpower.
We do. The biological reality completely invalidates the moral judgment.
It really does. You cannot will a dopamine transporter to slow down its reuptake process.
No, you can't.
And you cannot consciously command your locus coeruleus to optimize its noradrenaline output. Recognizing this mechanism is the absolute crux of the medical DOC text's mission.
It is. And, that brings us to the profound societal implications of actually adopting this correct understanding.
Yeah.
Because providing the knowledge is only the first step.
Right. Knowing the facts is great, But internalizing it requires a fundamental paradigm shift in how we interact with neurodivergent individuals in professional, academic, and personal settings.
Completely. When we view executive dysfunction through a moral lens, the default response is almost always punitive.
Oh, totally. We punish them.
Right. We reprimand the employee who misses a deadline, or we penalize the student who can't sit still, assuming that the punishment will provide the negative incentive required to force compliance.
We think if we just make them feel bad enough, they'll try harder.
Exactly.
Huh.
But when we view it through a medical mechanical lens, the punitive approach is revealed as not only cruel, but entirely ineffective. You cannot punish a mechanical deficit out of existence.
You can't yell at the car with no gas.
You really can't.
So this shift moves us from a punitive model to an accommodative and therapeutic model. Let's talk about what that looks like in practice. Because in a workplace context, this means restructuring workflows to actually align with the neurochemical realities of the employee.
Yes. So if an employee has a dopaminergic deficit regarding long-term, low-salience tasks, the solution isn't to threaten them with termination.
Right, because fear just pushes them into that hyper-aroused panic state, which doesn't help them focus anyway.
Exactly. The solution is to break the long-term project into immediate, highly salient micro-tasks with really frequent feedback loops.
So giving them artificial deadlines.
Yes, artificial deadlines, quick check-ins. You are artificially providing the dopamine stepping stones the brain needs to initiate action.
That's brilliant. It's just working with the brain instead of against it.
And it also requires a major reassessment of what we consider professional behavior.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah. If we know an individual's noradrenergic system struggles to filter background noise, allowing them to wear noise-canceling headphones at their desk or work in an isolated environment, that isn't a special privilege.
Right. It's not them being antisocial.
No, it is a necessary mechanical accommodation. The goal is to optimize the environment to support the individual's specific neurochemical parameters, allowing them to actually thrive and contribute effectively.
But implementing that, this requires a deeply uncomfortable self-audit from all of us. Because if you're listening to this, you have probably internalized the societal biases that equate productivity with moral worth and focus with character.
All have. It's built into our culture.
Right. So it requires actively checking our internal dialogue when we see someone struggling to execute a task. We have to replace that reflexive assumption of, oh, they aren't trying, with the scientifically accurate question of, what mechanical barrier is preventing their prefrontal cortex from initiating this action?
And that really is the ultimate value of scientific literacy in the public sphere.
Yeah.
Medical communication like this Japanese excerpt isn't just about disseminating biological facts.
No, it's way bigger than that.
It is fundamentally about expanding our capacity for empathy. Because true empathy requires an accurate understanding of the other person's reality. By detailing the polygenic origins and the catecholamine mechanisms of ADHD, science provides the literal framework for that empathy.
That is so well said. So, to distill the core insights from our analysis today, the origins of adult ADHD lie in a complex epigenetic interplay, where polygenic risk factors interact with physiological environmental triggers during development.
Right.
And the structural divergence manifests primarily in the impaired functioning of the dopamine and noradrenaline pathways, severely compromising the prefrontal cortex's ability to orchestrate executive function.
And crucially, this biological reality unequivocally proves that the behaviors associated with adult ADHD are not the result of core upbringing, nor are they a failure of willpower.
They are the external symptoms of an internal, measurable mechanical difference.
Exactly.
Taking this deep dive into the neurobiology of motivation and attention leaves us with a rather profound philosophical dilemma.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. If our ability to initiate tasks, sustain focus, and exert what we colloquially call drive, the very elements that society uses to define our work ethic and our character, if all of that is ultimately governed by the density of dopamine transporters and the signaling efficiency of the locus coeruleus.
The question of biological determinism becomes totally unavoidable.
Right. If the invisible fluctuations of neurotransmitters dictate the parameters of our willpower, we have to ask, how much of our perceived personality or our fundamental drive is truly autonomous?
And how much is simply the output of our baseline neurochemistry? Where does the machinery end and where does the self begin?
It is a question that challenges the very core of how we perceive our own agency. If your capacity to push through resistance is a function of a chemical cascade that you do not consciously control, it forces a radical reevaluation of how we judge ourselves and how we judge each other.
It really changes everything.
It does. We will leave you to ponder the boundaries of your own neurobiology. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the brain's mechanics. Until next time.